Hey everybody, welcome back to Horror Trans. My name is Stephanie Bree. I am a transgender woman, and I talk about all things horror. And today I'm reviewing the, I believe, 1983, I want to say, horror anthology, Creepshow. Creepshow is a collaboration between a bunch of people, most notably Stephen King and George A. Romero. There are, I didn't actually count, but I think there's like 4 or 5 short stories in this film, each of, I will say, varying degrees of quality, with a sort of wraparound story. But the wraparound is actually, more interestingly, for the purposes of this film, done in a comic book form. The wraparound starts the movie off with a boy who is clearly obsessed with horror. He's reading horror comics. He's got horror posters on his wall, horror action figures and memorabilia and masks and dolls and everything else. There's some sort of, and I'm going to be careful not to spoil the movie too much, there's some sort of conflict or something involving the dad and the mom and the boy. A trigger warning, the boy gets smacked by the dad for reading a horror comic. The dad quickly snags the comic and tosses it in the trash. And the wind blows it open, and that's the transition that takes us into the comic book where we are told our stories. I'm not going to break down each individual story too much. The first one is mostly, I'll just kind of give a brief synopsis, but I don't want to spoil them. The first one is mostly about an elderly man who, I guess it's Father's Day, and he just wants his cake. And for whatever reason, he's a rich man, by the way. For whatever reason, his family has not delivered his cake to him. And we get some flashbacks. Like I said, I'm going to be careful not to spoil it. And let's just say this one is kind of a zombie story, reanimated corpse story. And, okay, before I dig too deep into it, let me take a minute to talk about the things I like about this movie. And the number one thing I like about this movie, besides the fact that it features Stephen King not just as one of the writers and collaborators, but also he is the star of one of the short stories. So, yay. The biggest thing I like is the comic book framing. The comic book transitions are, I hate to say it, the best thing about this movie. This first short story about the cake is weak. If this was a movie by itself, this story, even if it was fleshed out in more detail, I would be giving this a Rent review, or even like a 1-star review if I did stars. This is not an interesting story. It was boring, and there were flashbacks within flashbacks within flashbacks, and Jesus Christ, that's convoluted, and it bothers me. It's like, get to the goddamn fucking point already. Now, the second thing I want to mention involving this film is the special effects. Now, obviously, this movie was made at a time before CGI, so I can't say it's all practical effects, because a lot of people use the word practical effects to mean anything that isn't CGI, but that's inaccurate, because sometimes optical effects are used to create illusions, which is the precursor to CGI. That being said, the majority of the practical effects in this film look pretty good for the time, comparable to other films around this period. That being said, some of them look atrocious, and I mean hideously awful, to the point where I'm going to use snippets of this film as evidence that practical is not always better than CGI, because some of the practical effects in this movie look god-awful, even for the time it was made, even when you compare it to what other films were doing. Now, that's not the movie as a whole, and I'll try to point out those effects as they become relevant. But there are some really good effects in this movie, but there are also some really awful effects in this movie. So it is very dated, absolutely. It doesn't look like... Some of the effects don't look 1983. They look like 1972. Like, come on, try harder. That being said, this first little short story, you're going to fall asleep, and you're going to be asking yourself, what the fuck have I gotten myself into? The second short story, which I'm going to be very careful not to spoil, involves a hillbilly, which I will spoil this. This is the appearance of Stephen King. This is his story. He plays a hillbilly character who, you've heard this story before. You've probably seen it in other films, Men in Black, most notably. A meteor crashes in his backyard, and he goes to investigate. Now, he has some really cheesy, over-the-top dream sequences, fantasies that we see depicted on film, where he is fantasizing about taking the meteor to the local university and then, I guess, paying him money for it, and he's imagining what he's going to do with the money, etc. Now, all I'm going to say is this short story takes a turn, and he does not get to take the meteor to the university, but what we get is a really fantastic sequence. Again, I don't want to spoil it, but I want to tell you, we get this really amazing sequence of, I'll just say, alien plant life taking over his farm. And it's really amazing, and it's really cool. Throughout the vast majority of this segment, the effects hold up, for the most part. The goo effects are a little... whatever. And some of the stuff in the dream sequences, the fantasy sequences, are a little wonky, but the rest of it's pretty good. This was probably my favorite of the short stories in the film. And not just because it's Stephen King, but also because, redneck. Rednecks and hillbillies are my bread and butter when it comes to horror movies. So, yay for that. The third story, oh, by the way, all-star cast, and I mean legit all-star cast. I didn't mention him, but Ed Harris was one of the main cast in the first story. Stephen King is the main focal point of the second story, obviously. The third story is actually interesting because you have Ted Danson as the main focal point, but you also have Leslie Nielsen in a role that is very much not your normal Leslie Nielsen. And if you know who he is, if you don't know who he is, okay, I'll say what I was going to say. If you know who he is, this role is going to shock you. If you don't know who he is, go look up the movies Airplane, The Naked Gun, Dracula Dead and Loving It, the 1990-something live-action interpretation of Mr. Magoo. You've seen him. You know who he is. But anyways, and Ted Danson is the star of Cheers, but he was also the head demon on The Good Place. Not the head demon, but the demon in charge of The Good Place. Spoilers, I guess, but it's too late. And Now, I can't tell you what happens in this story either without giving it away, but there's some kind of conflict between Ted Danson and, I guess, his wife or ex-wife, maybe? And the Leslie Nielsen character, which I believe was the ex-wife or wife's dad or lawyer, I don't remember. I was watching this movie trying to pay attention, but like I said, some of the details were a little fuzzy because the movie went by it goes by really fast. It's not a very long movie. This segment here is the longest segment in the film, I believe. And it's the one I lost interest in the most and wasn't paying close attention because I was bored, because it was like, come on, get on with it. But I will say, one of the... Well, I'll just say this. The villain of the story, and I'm not going to tell you who it is, buries the other guy all the way up to his head in the sand on the beach and leaves him to die. The rest of the story plays out from there. And again, you can kind of guess what's going to happen. But again, I'm not going to spoil it. The visual effects in this segment, again, the practical effects are mostly good, but some of them are not. Some of the, and I'm going to use the word visual effects instead of special effects here, because some of them are probably optical illusions. Some of them are probably like screen simulations. You know, they look fine for the time, obviously based on the technology that was available, but they look a little iffy at a couple spots. Look a little iffy, but beyond that, it's a pretty solid segment. The first 2/3 of this segment bored the living snot out of me, and I was just like, get the fuck on with it already. But the third act of this segment killed it for me. It was just like, it redeemed itself. The fourth segment might actually run as long as that third segment. It might run a little longer. I didn't actually time it. And again, I want to be careful how I frame this without giving it away. But basically, you have a rich guy who's married to a rich woman, and she's abusive to him. And I guess there's this research institute or hospital or something like that that receives a crate, and it turns out it's some sort of, I'm just going to use the word cryptid without describing it or getting into the particulars. It could be a wild animal, but it appeared to me as though it was intended to be some sort of cryptid. And basically, it breaks out of the box and kills people. That's the gist of it. Now, this is the segment where I'm going to flat out say the effects don't work at all. The creature effects are garbage. I don't know who did the creature effects. I hope to God it wasn't Tom Savini or somebody I actually respect, or who would go on to do real legitimate work later. But again, I didn't do my homework because I usually don't for these types of videos anyways. I just watch the movie and then give you my overall thoughts. Without spoiling it unless it's necessary to spoil it to review it. Because sometimes it is. Sometimes it's just like, look, I can't really tell you why this movie's good or bad without telling you why it's good or bad. So sometimes you have to spoil some things. And if I'm going to spoil something, I'll give you a heads up. The last segment, I'm not going to spoil or talk about at all. At all. I'm just going to say this segment does look good. This segment was really short and definitely unnecessary. And I didn't like it. It made me uncomfortable. Which is why I'm not going to talk about it. And then we get the finale of the wraparound. Which again, I don't want to spoil it. Now, intercut between each individual segment or story within the film, you get these amazing comic book transitions. Now, the comic book transitions are sort of reminiscent to the 2003 Hulk film from Universal Studios. The one with Jennifer Connelly. But it's also used as sort of, instead of on-screen text or lower thirds or whatever, title cards, etc. You get the little the comic book transitions, like, take you from one story to the next, turning of the pages and reading of the panels. But within that, you get on-screen comic book text in the form of, like, like the little comic book bubbles and things that set up, they wrap up the story you just watched and set up the story you're about to watch. And the comic book sections are my favorite part of this movie, I'm going to be honest with you. The wraparound is pretty good. I liked it, especially the conclusion. I won't spoil it, but the conclusion was satisfying to me. The second story is like, alright, I'll just give them star ratings, why not? The first story is 1 out of 5 stars, boring, pass. I wish they could cut it out of the movie. The second story, 4 out of 5 stars, I loved it. The ending was, not, I didn't see it coming, but it was, okay. The third story with Ted Danza and Leslie Nielsen, I would give that a 3.5 out of 5 stars. It's the first 2/3 don't work for me, but that third act really saved it. The fourth story, I'm going to give 2 out of 5 stars. It's about as boring and disinteresting as the first story. And the creature effects are awful, but it does have a, I will say, satisfying conclusion, which made me go, okay, alright, I'll allow it. And the fifth story, which I'm not even going to talk about, I will give it a 3.5 out of 5, even though it's the shortest of the 5, I guess. 6 if you count the wraparound. 4 or 5. How many are there? I lost count. Anyways, that one, 1, 2, 3, 4. The fourth story, so it would be 5 if you count the wraparound. Okay. I'm going to give it a 3.5 out of 5 stars, even though I can't really give you any more specifics. And the reason I can't is because it touches on a very specific phobia I have, and it made me very uncomfortable, so I can't really talk about it because the whole time I was cringing and covering my eyes. And I don't want to relive it right now. And that's all I'm going to say. And then the wraparound story, I'm going to get a 5 out of 5 stars, and I'm including the comic book interstitial transitions and, on just basically the comic book stuff is what I'm trying to say. That all together makes the film itself overall a high rewatchability. I will definitely give this one a chance, although I may stop it or fast forward before it gets to the creepy segment, or I may fast forward past it, whatever. If I'm watching on DVD and it has the skip feature, I might just skip to the next chapter. But anyways, yeah, this is a buy. I still think you're going to enjoy Creepshow for what it is. You may enjoy some of the segments that I didn't more than I did. You may enjoy some of the segments less than I did. It's all, but I think overall the film as a whole is enjoyable. And just the comic book stuff alone and the wraparound is worth it to me to go back and rewatch this again. I would probably put this in with my regular rotation. This is a movie I'm going to watch again. I'm just going to be very cautious. I'm going to be, maybe drinking some coffee during that first segment so I don't fall asleep. and closing my eyes during that. What was it? Fourth story, so I don't get so I don't vomit. But other than that, yeah, it's a good movie. I enjoy it. I highly recommend it. You should definitely be watching Creepshow. Stay cool.